It's time to turn some burl. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I have a piece of Oak Burl. Now I believe this is live oak, but I'm not 100% sure. It's definitely a white oak. And I'm going to cut a traditional bowl out of this, meaning a round top rim. I'm not going to do a live edge bowl. You may have seen my other burl video where I turned a live edge burl with a piece similar to this but larger, and that was pretty exciting. Now this, I have no idea what's going to be inside. I can see that there's some voids right here, so I'm going to want to position my cut when I cut out the circle cylinder for this to avoid these a little bit, but I don't know what other voids are in here. And that is the nature of burls. You really don't know. Now, some tree species produce burls that are very dense and compact, and they don't have a lot of voids in them, which is great for turning. The only downside is there's no grain direction, so you need to have a sharp bowl gouge and you can make really good clean cuts with each pass. There's no way to know where the end grain is and the side grain is because there isn't. It's just random grain patterns everywhere. Now the piece that I'm turning has the same situation where there's random grain patterns, but it's kind of blobbed together and there are voids in there as well. And inside some of those voids, there's actually bark growing inside the tree. So it's this random hodgepodge of wood to turn. You need to be a little adventurous when you're turning burl, and you have to be realistic because there's a chance that this will fall apart and might not turn out to be anything. On the other hand, the potential payoff can be extraordinary and we can have a really beautiful, very unique bowl. So I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw and I'm going to try to extract the cylinder that we're going to turn a bowl from. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm looking for the densest area in this burl so that I can make the largest cylinder possible. I'll use one of my circle templates to really size this up. I like using a circle template that's a little bit smaller than the actual size, and I can always keep that blade a little bit away from the template, so it'll make the circle a little bit larger. Going to take my time here and cut out this cylinder for the bowl blank. Now, something you need to be aware with the bandsaw, obviously you want your fingers away from that saw blade. And when you're working a piece of burr like this, there are noticeable voids in here, so the blade will cut through those voids very quickly. So you want to be aware of that and make sure you don't slip and yeah, you don't want to be slipping. You want a very controlled cut here. So it's worth taking your time and not forcing this too quickly. Right there you can see it's thinner and it's cutting through that area very quickly. So we've got the cylinder. There's some really large wormholes in here, which is okay. I don't mind that. It'll give it more character. It's looking pretty good. All right, I'm going to take this over to the lathe and we'll start turning it. First, I'm going to mount this with a faceplate, and I like to take my time and actually measure across the piece and figure out the center. And I'll do this from 4 directions. I'll do one direction, then go 90 degrees, and then I'll go about 45 to that, and then go 90 degrees to that. So I've got 4 different marks. It's giving me a rough idea where that center is. And looking straight through the faceplate, I will center that up and start the screws. Now I'll start one screw, but I won't finish that or tighten that because typically that will torque and move the whole faceplate off to the side. So I'll go and set the second screw and then I'll come back to that first screw and tighten it up. Then I'll put all the other screws in. The faceplate is going to give me a really secure connection to the lathe. I have never had, whoa, do you see all that dust come out? That's the dust in the wormholes. I've never had a faceplate fail on me. I probably shouldn't say that. I probably shouldn't say never, but they're very secure typically. Okay, so I'm using my 5/8 inch 55 degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And in case you're wondering, my two main tools are the 5/8 inch and the 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. They have the same bevel profile on them. Now the reason I'm using the 5/8 here is this is a perfect tool for roughing. It's really, really nice and well suited for roughing out the rough shape of a bowl. I'm keeping the nose pointed in the direction of the cut, and I'm just taking my time. I'm applying a lot of down pressure with my left hand so I get a nice smooth pass on the tool rest. You can see the shavings coming out of there. There's some that are more dusty than others. That is actually the debris that's in the wormholes in the blank. So there are worms in this bowl blank still, and for the life of me I can't imagine how long they're in there and what that must be like. They're obviously not claustrophobic because they're in a cavity that their only way out is to eat their way out. There you can see some of the wormholes. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the bottom of this bowl so that I can create a tenon or a connecting point. Again, using the 5/8 inch bowl gouge. It's interesting cutting burl because there's different densities in different situations. So there's voids in here, and then there's harder areas and softer areas. So there's a lot of inconsistency with the cut. So you just want to take your time and try to make a smooth pass across the tool rest. And give the tool plenty of time to make the cut. There's no need to rush. You can see some of that material in the center of the bottom of this bowl is breaking out. The fibers are being broken off there a little bit. And there's a lot of material that's missing. There's the bark enclosure there that's going to be within the range of the tenon, and I really don't want that to happen because if that bark comes loose on the tenon, then my tenon can come loose. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper. Hopefully I can get a big enough area to make a good solid tenon. My tool rest is a little bit high there. It's still a little bit high. Basically, you want the point of the tool that's cutting to be level with the center line. Look at that. Look at the sawdust falling out of the wormholes. So you can see on the top right edge of the bowl gouge, that's the point that's the cutting point, and that's what needs to be on the center line. And now that I dropped the tool rest just a touch, it was very close to the center line. All right, I'm going to use my dividers to mark the size of the tenon. Remember, don't let the right side of the divider touch. Now using my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, I'm going to cut the tenon and then the shoulder. So I'm going to cut right up to that line I scribed with the dividers. And then I'm going to shape the shoulder of this piece. And then with my spindle detail gouge, I'm going to get in here and I'm going to turn or cut the dovetail angle of the tenon so that it will match the angle on the 4-jaw chuck. Remember, we want the top of the jaws of the 4-jaw chuck to rest on the shoulder, and we need the dovetails to lock into the dovetail tenon shape. Now I'm going to mark the center of this so it's easier to align when I bring it back up to the tailstock later on to remove that foot. Now I'm showing you this angle so you can see how I'm shaping this. Now that we have the tenon and shoulder defined, I'm going to go ahead and shape the outside exterior of this bowl. making large curving arcs here to start shaping that exterior. Now I'm keeping the handle of the bowl gouge tight against my body, and my hands and arms are stationary. They're fixed against my sides, and only my body movement or the shifting of my weight is making that curve. Now I've got a great big bark enclosure area there that I need to be aware of. So I'm going to have to reduce that down just a bit. I'm getting something odd's happening here. Oh, we have a whole section. Uh-oh. This is getting dicey. That whole section is going to come out. It was smacking my bowl gouge, and I was trying to figure out why I was getting extra pressure on the bowl gouge. Well, that's going to come out, so we're just going to go ahead and get that out of there and take a look at it. Now, notice how I'm off to the back side of this. I'm out of the line of fire. Ooh, but my camera wasn't. It just moved everything around. Now I've got now you can see the piece that shot out of there. This is what I was talking about. It's almost like a big lump of dough that's been balled up and like doubled up on itself. This burl is not super compact like some burls are. So now I have an even larger bark enclosure area that needs to be addressed. I can't leave that large like it is right now, because if I do, then I'm going to have a great big hole in the side of this bowl. And this brings up a really good point, because many times I hear people say they want to just work with the wood and do what the wood tells them to do. And I think that sounds good, but in reality, we approach the wood and create what we want first. We go to a chunk of wood and think, well, I'm going to make a medium-sized bowl out of this, or I'm going to make a large bowl or small bowl. And we have some idea or notion of what we want first, and then we work with the wood. Yes, we do need to conform to what the wood is going to dictate. In this case, we have this large hole that I have to deal with on the side of this bowl. What I'm doing right now is I'm using the scraping cut to flatten up the top rim. This helps me see exactly where that rim is going to be located, so that I know what the top of this is going to be shaped like. And there's the piece that shot out of there. You can see it was pretty much, it wasn't attached because it's two sections of bark. It was basically folded over, and then it popped out of there. So this section's still rather large, and my tools are getting dull, so it's time to jump over to the sharpening station. With this hard wood and with the grain directions varying as much as they do, I'm sharpening pretty frequently with this piece. About every 10 minutes, I'm over at the sharpening station, setting up that edge again. If you need to know more about sharpening your tools and shaping them, including how to make various bowl gouge grinds, including my 55-degree bevel swept-back bowl gouge, I've got a course online that teaches you everything you need to know about shaping and sharpening your tools. Once you have your sharpening system set up, sharpening the tools is no big deal. It's simply a quick visit over to the grinder and your tools are sharp again. So it's super important for turning and having a successful time turning. You really need to be able to sharpen your tools and understand the whole process. So check out that course. This is my 5/8 55-degree bevel swept-back bowl gouge, and it was past due for sharpening. It was pretty worn down there. It took me quite a few passes back and forth to sharpen it there. You can see all the wormholes that are in here as well. So I'm going to start at the base of the bowl, and I'm going to make passes up to the top of the bowl to really define the shape and get the exterior of the bowl established. Remember, the exterior of the bowl is the bowl, meaning you need to establish that outer shape because the interior of the bowl should simply be mimicking the exterior of the bowl. The other thing that I'm doing here by making another pass is I'm reducing the diameter of the bowl and reducing the size of that bark enclosure. When we get close to the final shape of the bowl, we want to be making relatively thin passes. We don't want to be cutting away a lot of material at this point. We're doing just enough to shape the piece. And in this case, I am taking just a touch more because I want to reduce that window or that opening where that bark enclosure is. I like the idea of there being bark, and I like the idea of there being an opening, but I don't want it to be so large that it's not proportional. And that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to make this a closed rim bowl, meaning that the rim will be narrower than the widest point of the bowl. Visually, I like the way that it appears. It makes the bowl a little bit more interesting. And the way I'm doing this is I'm starting from the rim and cutting back towards the height or the high point of the bowl or the apex of the exterior, so the higher point. So I'm going to match those two sides up. And then I'm going to merge it together with a shear scrape. So just take your time and make these cuts very light and precise. We're not in a rush here. We can move faster when we're roughing, but we don't want to do that when we're making finishing cuts. Here you can see there's a little bit of a high spot where those two curves meet. So I'm going to use the shear scrape to ease the transition between those two curves. Oops, bumped the camera there. So I have the handle dropped on this, so I'm essentially just shaving away a very fine amount. I'm not removing a ton of material. I'm just shaving away a fine amount and merging that curve so it's one fluid curve. Again, this is where you really want to take your time and make sure you're getting the exterior the exact way you want it. I just noticed a grub that I need to get out of there. Sorry, little guy. I have no idea how those things can stay in the bowl blank at the speed that is rotating. Okay, I'm using shellac to stiffen up all of the fibers, in particular around the tenon and the shoulder. There's a little bit of odd material there that's not as solid as I would like it to be. Shellac is a great product that can be used as a tool. I like to use it as a glue or as an adhesive, and it helps bind material together. It's also good for applying before you sand, so it could be used as a sanding sealer. But also, with this thing wet, look at the grain in this bowl. Isn't that gorgeous? And isn't it completely random? I don't see any defined grain direction anywhere on this. So I'm going to put this shellac on now. I'm not using this as a finish. I've let that dry at this point. I'm using this to secure any of the loose wood fibers and to strengthen the tenon just a bit. So I'm going to take the faceplate off and I'm going to mount this to the 4-jaw chuck. Going to make sure that seats right on top of those jaws, nice and flat, and tighten it up. All right, so back to the 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I'm going to lightly remove material from the inside here. Now I need to be a little bit cautious because I'm not quite sure how stiff that tenon is. And the only time I've had tenons fail is when the wood is brittle. And there are brittle points in this wood, and that's why I use the shellac to hopefully stiffen some of that up. So I'm going to make light passes here. I'm not going to get aggressive and dig deep and try to remove material very quickly. I'm going to make light passes and remove some of the bulk material on the inside of this. Plus I have that big void there, and I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to have another piece come off or what. I'm hoping not, because that would be unfortunate. But there's a big section that I don't know exactly how it's supported or attached. And the more material I remove, the higher the potential it is for that piece to go flying. Also, I'm not doing this in particular for this bowl, but I do it all the time. Do you see where I'm standing? I'm off to the left of the screen here. and I'm not standing in front of this blank. If some piece of this wood decides it wants to come off, it's going to go flying in line with the rotation of this bowl. So I should be out of the way. And of course, I've got my face shield and my safety glasses on. What I'm doing here is I'm using my smaller 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge to make some light finishing cuts on the rim of this bowl. I like to make the rim angle downward into the bowl. Now I'm going to establish the wall thickness. I don't want this to be very thick. The thicker it is, the better it's going to be for durability and staying together, but I want it to look elegant as well. This is more of a display bowl. I know it's going to be filled with holes, and so obviously we're not going to be using it too functionally. I guess it could hold fruit and things like that, but this is more of a display piece, more of a appreciate the wood species and check out the amazing beauty of nature type of bowl. So I do want this to be relatively thin, so I'm going to establish that wall thickness here just very gradually. I'm going to do the top section of the wall. I'm going to establish the thickness. And once I'm happy with that thickness, I'm going to continue that wall thickness all down the bowl. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm looking down onto the tool and I'm lining up the bevel with the exterior of the bowl. That way I'm cutting parallel to the exterior. Here I'm removing a little bit of extra material that's down inside the lower portion there, but then I'm returning to mirroring that bevel to the exterior wall. I like the way the material's removing there, and you can see the edges and the bark enclosure and all that. I'm really happy with that. It appears to be relatively solid. Hopefully it all stays in place. I do need to remember I have voids on that rim. So if I get a catch in there and that catch occurs with the tool at one of those open spots, it could easily snag that open rim and tear it apart. So that makes this a little dicey as well. So now this technique that I use, I work down the wall. Instead of working from the inside out, I work from the outside in. And what's interesting here is you can see I'm using the left side of the bowl gouge. Well, the nice thing about that is the left side and the right side, as you can see here, I'm using the right side of the bowl gouge now as I'm cutting along with the wall. I'm using both sides of the bowl gouge, which gives me a little bit more time with this tool before I need to return to the sharpening station. If I were making every cut from left to right and just using the right side of the bowl gouge, that's going to wear down and become dull very quickly. And I won't take advantage of the fact that there's other parts of the cutting edge that are still sharp. So you want to stop frequently and feel that wall thickness. And as you feel down to where you've cut, the bottom portion should be a little bit thicker, so that as you go, you're thinning it right to the wall thickness you want as you go. You obviously don't want to go too thin or thinner than your existing wall below the top part of the wall. The idea is to keep the wall thickness even all the way across from the top to the bottom. And here I go again with the left side of the bowl gouge, removing some of the material from the mass in the center. The mass in the center really helps hold and stabilize those exterior walls. And this bowl is a great example. I've had several people point out, well, you could just use your left hand and use that to support the outside of the wall and hold it up against the wall. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't like holding my hand against a very fast rotating piece of wood, especially one that has voids in it with very sharp edges and could blow apart. So I would rather keep my left hand where it is right now and helping and aiding and controlling that tool versus trying to hold and stabilize the outside of the bowl. So the center mass inside this bowl stabilizes that outside wall, and it prevents it from flexing or vibrating, especially when we're turning wet green wood or a live edge bowl. Here this wood is pretty well equalized or dry, and it's not going to flex too much, I don't believe, and shouldn't distort much as far as the equalization of the moisture in the wood at this point. So I've removed an area and cleared out down to the wall, but not quite. And then I'll make light passes to continue that wall thickness down into the bottom of this bowl. I find this part of turning very relaxing too. It's just kind of fun to knock down those sections and watch the inside of the bowl diminish. Now that void is really worrying me because it looks like it goes all the way to the bottom. It looks like if I remove more material, that thing's just going to come flying off of there. And there's the window on the bottom. You can see where that bark enclosure was that we reduced so it wasn't too huge. All right, well, here goes nothing. I'm going to thin down this wall section and bring it down to the same thickness as the upper wall. And again, we're going to stop and take a look. It seems to be holding. There's the window of that bark enclosure. And it looks pretty good. It's a little thick. I can take that down just a bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm rubbing the heel first and then the bevel, and I'm just doing a very light cut. You can see there it's just a small amount of materials being removed just to bring that thickness down just a touch. There's wormholes in there that are sideways. There's a wormhole in this that's fascinating. It is down the sidewall and parallel with the sidewall. So it goes in, there's a hole or an opening on the inside of the bowl and a hole or opening on the outside and a tunnel that connects the two of them. It's incredible that these insects, their grubs will bore through these. I actually had one bowl that I was turning, and I was turning and I opened up a worm cavity, and instead of there being a grub in there, there was a great big black beetle that just walked right out of the bowl. And again, the bowl was spinning at crazy RPMs, and somehow this creature just had the ability to just walk out like nothing was going on. I would love to know how that is or why. How do they not get dizzy? All right, so it's looking good, and that window seems to be a really nice size. It's not huge at all. So I'm going to take the center mass down. Now, the other thing, too, about taking the center mass down is I'm not going to return to that higher wall. If I go up to that higher wall, even though this bowl is relatively equalized, it's still flexing and vibrating. And my tool's not going to make a good solid connection because that flexing and vibrating is going to make it smack the tool, and that's a good way to have a bowl blow apart. Most people that have their bowl blow apart, it's because they second guess what they did at the top of the bowl right now. Most of the material is gone, and they decide that I'm just going to go back up to that rim and like tweak it a little bit. And it doesn't like to be tweaked when it's flopping around at a really fast RPM. Boy, there's a big bark enclosure in the middle of this piece, and it's making me nervous. I'm just going to take this whole center portion down and see what happens. Like I said before, this reminds me, if you've ever made pizza dough, and instead of balling it up into a nice round ball, you kind of make a big long rope out of it and then just fold it over itself so it's kind of blobbed together. That's kind of how this burl has grown, or at least that's how it feels to me. Because it's not in one big shape, and it's not dense and compact. It has big voids in it, and there's voids with bark on them. It's almost as if there's a big limb that was liquefied and just balled up into a big mass, and it just kept growing. So I'm taking the center down, and I got to be really cautious here. I don't know. This is getting really dicey. I don't know if this is going to stay together or not. I feel like there was enough material on the tenon and no big voids on the tenon that it should hold together, but there's no way to know for sure. This is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept-back bowl gouge, and I'm pointing the nose in the direction of the cut. In this case, I'm moving left to right, which is the supported grain cut for the inside of this bowl. And it looks like it might stay the other side. That window is really cool. This part is still a big void down in there. We'll just keep working our way down in there. I think I'm going to change my tool rest to my inside curved tool rest. Now, the inside curved tool rest is nice because it just gets me a little bit closer to that surface, so I have a little bit more support with the bowl gouge. I'll put a link to the curved tool rest plus all the tools that I used for this bowl in the description below this video, so you want to check that out. There's another grub. Let's get this little guy out of there. There you go. All right, good job. You ate plenty of wood there. Anybody else? Nope. Okay. How in the world they can ride in there, I'll never know. Maybe there's a scientist that knows how they can handle that centrifugal force. So I know that I'm not down to my final depth. I'm just stopping here so I can take a look and make sure everything is intact and I've got enough integrity to keep cutting. It seems as if there's enough material that it's going to be okay. Instead of doing the whole bottom section, I'm going to just do this section that's about 1.5 inches wide and bring that down to the same thickness, wall thickness as the other area. Still a little thick, so I'm going to rub the heel and then establish a cut and just make a really light cut there. Now I'm going to go across the center portion and get that ready. Very light cuts here. I also just stopped to sharpen this tool. I don't show you guys every sharpening because it would get boring after a while, but there's probably 5 or 6 sharpenings during this turning. It's a little bit high, so I'm going to make a very light, relatively open cut to finish off the inside curve. I want that inside curve to be a nice flowing curve that goes from the sides all the way down through the bottom. And it looks like that section that had the big void in it is doing okay. I still have a little bit too much material there, so I'm going to take some of that out. And I think we're getting closer there. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this little dental tool, which is really handy, and I'm going to pull out as much loose debris in these crevices as possible. And there's quite a bit there. These wormholes are impacted with debris. You can see how much is coming out there. So I'm going to take my time and clean that out really well. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm shellac the interior just like I did the exterior. This will help stiffen up all of those loose surfaces and make it easier to sand as well. Most of this shellac will be sanded away. I'm going to put a oil finish on this. The shellac is just there as a stiffening agent to stiffen up the wood fibers for sanding. Look at that wood grain and that pattern. Isn't that incredible? So with the shellac dry, I'm going to sand this bowl. I'm going to sand the exterior and the interior. I'm going to just take my time. Working through the grits, I'm looking for any kind of tool marks and I'm going to sand those all off. I'm sanding the exterior with the lathe running, and then I'm going to go back over and look for any kind of imperfections that could use a little bit more sanding. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the interior. Look for any edges, a little bit of tool marks up along the top inside of this rim, and those can be sanded out. If you want to just take your time and sand the individual problem areas, if I leave the lathe running and try to sand those, I'm just going to accentuate those marks. Instead, I can almost erase them by just using the edge of the sander here. You just want to take your time, and I'll move through all the different grits and get this down to 320 grit at the end. I've got a video all about sanding if you'd like to check that out. There's a lot more information on how to sand bowls. All right, so we have the bowl done and it's sanded. It's looking pretty good. I need to take the tenon off and turn that into a foot. I do not like leaving thick feet or bases on the bowl. I would rather have a designed foot that matches the rest of the bowl. In this case, I've made the shoulder relatively small, and I'm going to use the tenon to become the foot. Now remember the little mark that we made with the spindle detail gouge? Well, I'm going to use that little mark in the center point to line up the tailstock, and it makes it that easy to essentially get back to center and start cutting. So I'm going to use my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back to push down this shoulder, which we no longer need, and get my tool rest in just the right spot there. It slipped just a bit and was going in towards the turning. So I'm using and making a scrape cut here using the 1/2 inch bowl gouge. Now I'm going to shape the tenon and make it into the foot. And it's a little wider and the angle is a little steeper. The dovetail angle is a little steeper than what I'm looking for this bowl. So I'm going to take this, shape the exterior of the foot, and do a scraping cut to shape the area that blends in for the base of the foot up to the shoulder, or where the shoulder was rather. And I'll reposition my tool rest and do a shear scrape to further blend in the cut between the shoulder and the side of the bowl. Just want to take your time here. You can see the shavings coming off are relatively thin, very, very light passes, just merging two areas together. Then I want to clean up that joint at the bottom of the foot and the side of the bowl. All right, so with the exterior of the foot shaped, now I'm going to create the interior. First pass I want to do is flatten out the rim of the foot. And then I'm going to cut out the material in the inside of the foot. And I'm using a backwards scraping, it's kind of a push cut, kind of a scraping cut to shape that interior foot. You want to be very careful here not to engage the full front of this bowl gouge. I'm using an open stance, meaning that flute is pointing straight up. It's very dangerous. If that gets wood on all sides of it, it will create a catch, meaning the bowl gouge will become overwhelmed and it won't be able to cut through that material fast enough, and it's going to create a jam, and it'll most likely throw the bowl off the lathe. So I want to be very, very intentional and precise and deliberate when I make that move. And I also need to make sure that I'm not putting the bowl gouge in a position where it's going to engage multiple areas. So I'm going to shape the foot again. And I've got to get that little crevice in the center there. That's the only area I was touching. And now I'm rolling the flute around to get the side and shape that. Now I'll take this nub down. I've got to be really cautious here because there's a lot of imperfections in this wood. And if there's a void in this little dinky nub that is holding this to the lathe, it could become an issue. I don't actually want to stop the lathe because if there is a void, the torque of stopping it and restarting it could be enough to throw it off. I had to check though. It seems to be okay.
So I'm using the spindle detail gouge to get in here and to reduce that nub just a little bit further. And now I'm going to do a push cut into the base of that nub and turn the lathe off at the same time. And that severs that piece cleanly. Then I'll just sand that area and we'll be ready to go. So now we have the bowl is complete except for the little bit of sanding that needs to take place on the bottom. All right, so with the bottom all sanded, you can look at the pattern of the crane, how it's all just whirled around there. I'm going to use my wood burner to sign the bowl. I like using this chisel tip because I like to pull the letters. When you get an excessive burn marks there too, you can lightly sand that. The deeper burnt areas will stay, but the little burned stuff on top will be removed. Now I'm going to use tried and true Danish oil. And the reason I'm using Danish oil is it's going to get down in those crevices and grooves a lot easier, and it's going to be easier for me to remove. Because the tried and true original finish has the beeswax in it, and that's a great finish for a piece that's being used all the time, especially like a salad bowl. But for a piece like this is more of a display piece. I just need a thin layer of finish on this, and I don't want it to be excessive. So what happens is I'll apply a thin coat, and I'll kind of put an excessive amount down into some of these grooves, and then I'll take a clean cloth and make sure that I remove that from those areas. The reason why you want to remove it, you want to remove any thick or high spots, is this oil will cure and set up after about 36 hours. This is pure boiled linseed oil, and that's it, nothing else. There's no additives to it. That's why I like this product. This isn't even made in the United States, from what I understand. It's actually made in Britain, and is made in small batches because the linseed oil that's called boiled linseed oil in the United States is boiled with metals. It's actually not boiled with heat. It's boiled with metals and various chemicals and things like that. So there's all these different additives that get put into it, and it's not as pure as this. So anyway, all that being said, wow, look at that grain. Isn't that incredible? The finish that you're putting on with this oil needs to be really thin, and then you wipe off any excess, and that way you don't have any of the excess curing, and then it gets gummy. You definitely don't want that. So you want to take as much time wiping off any extra finish, about 20-30 minutes after you apply it, as you do apply it, especially with these little holes, because it can drip out of those for a little while. But the nice thing about this oil is easy to apply, and I can put multiple coats on it. That's why I like using the Danish oil instead of the original oil. It is absolutely gorgeous. I am so happy this thing held together, and I had no idea that it was going to hold together like that. There was no way to know until you actually turn the piece. And there it is. Wow. Look at all that tension and the changing direction and the wormholes and the bark enclosures, and it's amazing. There's that window on the side that has bark on it. Look at that. I think the size worked out really good. Had I made this bowl larger, that window would have been really big. I love this little cutaway section on the side too. It's so cool. And off to the right there is that wormhole I was mentioning. You can see right down the side there's a cavity where the worm, that's the tunnel that the worm had eaten through. Unbelievable. Nature is absolutely amazing. Wow. Just love looking at these things. After a few more coats of the Danish oil, this is going to look even more beautiful.
Wow, that got dicey in a few places. I didn't know if by removing this interior, if we were going to have a whole side panel blow out or not. Luckily we didn't. But man, oh man, is this pattern random and completely unknown until you start turning. Also, it got a little grubby inside there. I had to pull out a couple grubs, and that's pretty usual with a nice hardwood like this. This wood's been sitting around for almost 5 years, so it's pretty much stabilized or equalized, and I'm not really worried about it moving. However, it's oak, and oak will move and do whatever it likes to do pretty much anytime it wants. So if you've ever turned oak, you know what I'm talking about. But look at these patterns. Isn't that gorgeous? Wow. Nature is absolutely amazing. And you take that burl that we started with, that big ugly piece of burl that looks like horse manure, and this is hiding inside of it. Who would have thought? This big opening here, which had a section pull away, would have been a lot larger if I had left this bowl just another 1/2 inch wider. Instead, I reduced the bowl size, kind of made that decision on the fly, so that it would also reduce the size of this opening, and I think it turned out pretty cool. This also has bark. This is bark enclosure, and that means this bark was growing inside the tree. This wasn't exterior bark. It's just crazy how trees will do things, especially when it comes to burls. Just the complete randomness of the way it's growing. So if you take anything away from this, when you're turning burls, you have to be open-minded. You have to be willing to go on an adventure. You also have to be willing to possibly not come out with something pretty decent. There's a good chance that can happen. Could blow apart, could do different things. But you also have the chance of coming out with something really cool like this. So if you get a hold of some burl, definitely turn it and let me know how it turns out for you. If you've liked this video, do me a huge favor and click that like button below the screen. Thank you so much for doing that. That helps this video and it helps the whole channel, and I thank you for taking the time to click that like button. Also, if you're not subscribing, why not? Subscribe, please. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my website, you're in for a great treat. Over at turningwoodbowl.com, you're going to find everything you need to know about turning wood bowls. And you will find my online courses there, where I will teach you everything from understanding the tools, how to sharpen them, and how to deal with green wood, and of course, my wood bowl turning course. So check those out. All right, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and happy turning.